I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the North Korean general sent to lead troops in Ukraine, hear the latest from Georgia, and consider the impact of the First World War on Putin's worldview, and how the treaty that ended the battles of the Eastern Front serves as a warning for today.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong. Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 1st of November, 2 years and 257 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by veteran of the Telegraph foreign desk, Venetia, Rainey, live from Dearnley, Georgia, Marika Mikiashvili, and from Germany, historian Dr. Thomas Clausen. I began, however, with the latest news from the battlefield. Let's return first to Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, the location of the most significant strategic activity of the past week or so, as Russian forces seek to progress towards Pokrovsk. Russian forces marginally advanced east and southeast of that settlement amid continued Russian offensive operations, according to the ISW and others. Geolocated footage published yesterday indicates that Russian forces recently advanced south of Novotoretsk to the east of Pokrovsk and northwest of Selido to the southeast of Pokrovsk, as attacks were also attempted in nearby villages and towns. In short, it would appear that Kremlin forces are seeking to push home their advantage there. A spokesperson for a Ukrainian brigade operating in Pokrovsk reported that Russian forces began to use buggies to transport infantry for assaults, and that elements of the Russian 74th Motorized Rifle Brigade and 3 other motorized brigades are operating in the Ukrainian brigade's area of responsibility. Pokrovsk City Military Administration reported that Ukrainian authorities are blocking some areas of the city to prepare defences, and noted that its forces have been constructing echelon defences in Pokrovsk since 2022, though many are asking, will it be enough? To give you a sense of the concern held by some, Colonel General Dmytro Marchenko, one of Kyiv's major generals, told a Ukrainian MP in an interview on YouTube that, quote, "I won't be revealing a military secret if I say that our front has crumbled." He was citing a dwindling supply of ammunition as one of the main reasons for Ukraine's weakening front line, and described Zelensky's victory plan as misguided in conception. Pokrovsk, as I touched on earlier in the week, is a major Ukrainian logistics hub that the Russian army has made a priority target. If they take it, the feeling is it will serve as a key linchpin for further advances. But as with Bakhmut, one has to wonder whether the settlement's previous strategic significance has been eroded over time, or even evaporated, by the devastation that's been wrought in recent weeks. To what extent can it still be considered a logistics hub if much of it is rubble? Now, to Kursk, Russia next, where Moscow's forces recently launched 2 mechanised counterattacks that resulted in marginal confirmed gains in the Ukrainian salient there. Footage, now verified, showed Ukrainian forces repelling a Russian platoon-sized mechanised assault west of northwest Sudza, indicating that Russian forces recently marginally advanced in that area near that settlement. Just to remind listeners, Sudza is the area where Thomas Much reported live for us from, and indeed that Francis Farrell of the Kyiv Independent has been in the past and described his visit to there for us recently. Additional geolocated footage published yesterday showed that elements of the Russian 83rd Separate Airborne Brigade and the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade launched a counterattack southeast of Koronevo and marginally advanced in that area. It is understood that in an attempt to dislodge the Ukrainians, the Russian military is suffering high casualties in these assaults. The ISW report on a post by 7 service members of the Russian 382nd Naval Infantry Battalion, which featured a video appeal from several days ago accusing the Russian military command of committing the battalion to costly frontal assaults in Kursk. The service members announced they will not return to the front lines and noted that the battalion lost 2 of its 4 assault groups in combat. We can't verify that, only that the fighting is fierce and continues. Elsewhere on the battlefront, offensive operations northeast of Kharkiv city near Vovchansk continue. The spokesperson of a Ukrainian brigade operating in the Kharkiv direction stated Ukrainian forces are successfully defending against small-scale Russian infantry assaults there, and that the forces are using motorcycles, buggies and all-terrain vehicles, along with other unarmoured vehicles, to conduct those assaults. In the drone war, Ukrainian sources say that in the past 2.5 days, the Russians launched 4 Iskander ballistic missiles from Rostov Oblast and occupied Crimea, 8 cruise missiles from aircraft over the Black Sea, and 43 drones, including Shaheds and unspecified drone models from Kursk and Oryol Oblasts. For the impact of some of those, I'd point listeners to Dom's section in yesterday's podcast, which laid it out extremely starkly. Finally, just to return once more to the subject of North Korea, the Telegraph has published today details of the man North Korea's Kim Jong-un has sent to Russia to lead Pyongyang's troops in Ukraine. General Kim Yong-bok is the deputy head of the North Korean army and a veteran of the country's Storms Corps Special Forces. I mean, we should use that term veteran rather sparingly, given that North Korea has not operated in open combat for many decades, but clearly he's been extensively involved in those forces. He's often photographed standing next to Kim Jong-un, smiling rather sycophantically and taking notes. We expect that North Korean soldiers will be fighting on the front lines of Ukraine within days. And that's something that's been reported not only by US intelligence, but is also being pushed very strongly by Ukrainian intelligence. And there's no reason to doubt the Ukrainian intelligence on this issue because they've been proven prescient so far. In a statement to the UN on Wednesday, Ukraine named General Kim as the most senior North Korean officer sent to Russia ahead of its entry into the conflict. It also called the military alliance between Moscow and Pyongyang a threat to Europe, the Korean Peninsula, its neighbours, and beyond. And just for another example of that, one needs only see that Pyongyang has just test-fired one of its newest and most powerful missiles to boost its nuclear deterrent in Kim Jong-un's first weapons missile test since being accused of sending soldiers to Russia. Tokyo, of course, another country extremely concerned, Japan, that the ICBM class missile flew for longer than any previously tested by the North, being airborne for about 86 minutes and hitting altitudes of 7,000 kilometres. General Nakatiani, the Japanese defence minister, told reporters, "We estimate that its flying altitude was the highest we have ever seen." Seoul, South Korean capital, has warned that the North was preparing to test fire another intercontinental ballistic missile or even conduct some kind of nuclear test ahead of next week's US elections. Whether this was that test or whether there is still one to come remains to be seen. All of this only underscores the concerns that Russia is assisting North Korea in its development of missile technology, perhaps even nuclear technology, in exchange for Pyongyang's support in the conflict. But for more of this, I am delighted to welcome back to the podcast Venetia Rainey, who long-standing listeners will recall was a regular voice on Ukraine the Latest in the first year of the war during her time as an editor on the Telegraph's foreign desk. She's since had a baby and now works with our audio team on various projects, including co-hosting our sister podcast Battle Lines with Roland Oliphant. Venetia, it's great to be sharing the airwaves with you again. I was talking about North Korea there, but there are also some interesting developments in the political realm relating to their increasing involvement in the war. What has caught your eye?
Thanks, Francis, and it's really good to be back. Hello to all listeners again. Yes, as you mentioned, the deepening military cooperation between North Korea and Russia is definitely also being echoed in the political sphere. Just today, we've got the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov hosting his North Korean counterpart, Chae Son-hee, in Moscow for talks. Now, neither country have specified an agenda for the talks, but there are reports in South Korea that these might be around high-level discussions about sending additional troops to Russia and also, of course, negotiating what the North would get in return. Sergei Lavrov said today that ties between Moscow and Pyongyang have reached an unprecedented high level over the past few years. And this meeting comes off the back of a digital communications agreement that the two countries also signed earlier this week. And I think it shows you something interesting about where Russia sees itself going in the future in terms of its internal politics, which obviously has an impact on Ukraine as well, particularly on the occupied areas. So the Institute for the Study of War said that the two countries signed a digital communications agreement, and it comes off the back of another agreement in July between the countries' prosecutor general's offices, and that they suspect that it's about enhancing the Kremlin's digital authoritarianism tools in order to increase repression online. Obviously very worrying for what remains of Russia's opposition, particularly given that no such thing exists in North Korea. So yes, that's that for North Korea.
Well, thanks, Venetia. We've spoken quite extensively on this podcast in recent days about the increased involvement of the South Koreans. I wonder if there's any further update on where we are in that story.
Yeah, so South Korea is really the big player that everyone's looking at the moment. They're obviously a major arms manufacturer in Asia. They've got vast stockpiles of military armaments, and most of these would actually be compatible with what's already being used in Ukraine. So it's really seen as a huge prize. And South Korea also actually has extra production capacity to deliver more missiles and so on at speed, which is obviously something that Kyiv's allies lack right now, that you guys have spoken about extensively on this podcast. But so far, Seoul has refused to supply Ukraine. It's only given non-lethal aid. But this North Korean development is changing all of that. They're really worried, South Korea, that North Korea is going to get Russian defense technologies in exchange for its troop deployment. And also that North Korean troops, as you mentioned, they're not experienced on the battlefield, but if they are deployed in Ukraine, they will start to get some of that experience. And that could really tip the security balance in the Korean peninsula. Obviously something that Seoul don't want to see. So there are now growing signs that they're thinking of changing their long-held policy about supplying arms directly to Ukraine. The FT reports today that President Yoon Suk-yeol has vowed not to sit idle in response to the North Korean deployment. His office actually confirmed this week that Seoul intends to send a delegation to Ukraine to monitor the North Korean forces. There was a call earlier this week between Yoon and his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky. Obviously, Zelensky knows that South Korea coming in and providing him with arms would be a huge game changer for Ukraine. So Zelensky is starting to throw a lot at this. He's said yesterday that he's going to send a representative to Seoul to make detailed requests for artillery and air defense systems. And he also gave an interview to a South Korean television channel called KBS. That was released yesterday, but it's part of his propaganda warfare, which we know he's incredibly good at. He said that Putin is testing the reaction of the West, of NATO states, and the reaction of South Korea. And if there is nothing, and I think the reaction to this is nothing, it's been zero, then the number of North Korean troops on our border will be increased.
Thanks, Venetia. So there's much more for us to be keeping an eye on relating to North Korea and South Korea than it seems many are on in the broader Western media at the moment. And of course, we will return to it. But turning again to Russia, I was referencing a story yesterday about possible talks taking place between Ukrainian and Russian intelligence over possibly not striking each other's energy infrastructure over winter. But what is Putin saying publicly? Is there any sign of a shift in tone?
I think there's a really short answer to this. No. Bloomberg had a report today about a call between Serbian President Alexander Vučić, where he spoke with Putin earlier this month for the first time in 2.5 years. And apparently Vučić brought up the subject of a ceasefire or some sort of agreement and talks. And Putin responded that Russia will fulfill all of its goals of its special military operation in Ukraine. So no change of tone there. There are a few more stories that I think are worth flagging, just smaller bits from around the world that are relevant to Ukraine. So here in the UK, we had the budget this week, obviously. It included £3 billion of guaranteed military support to Ukraine per year and, in quote, for as long as it takes. So that's obviously an incredibly encouraging sign for Ukraine. And it comes after Norway this week announced a whole new military aid package worth 500 million euros, including weapons and spare parts for F-16 fighter jets. But of course, the big military aid comes from the US. So all eyes are on the election there this next week. Whether Trump or Harris wins will have huge ramifications for Ukraine, which you guys have been covering extensively on the podcast. Over in Canada, we have seen this week that over 45 countries have signed a pledge to support facilitating the return of Ukrainian captives and deportees taken by Russia. Now, this was at the slightly dull-sounding Ministerial Conference on the Human Dimension of the Peace Formula held in Montreal. This conference is aimed at looking specifically about releasing prisoners and deportees, and it's got a particular focus on children. And that's very important because 20,000 children have been confirmed as abducted by Russia since the start of the war, and only 400 of them have been returned home, according to the Children of War database. So we're hopeful that that will see some progress. That's Zelensky's attempt to bring countries around the world together to think about solutions for some of these barriers to a peace plan. And then just lastly, in Hungary, I thought this was interesting because, of course, Hungary, a major sticking point in Europe in terms of Ukraine's ascension to NATO and the EU. Kyiv is apparently preparing a bilateral cooperation document with Budapest. They want to clear up some misunderstandings, according to Zelensky. There's no information about what specific agreements that would include, but Zelensky said that in return for resolving some issues, for example, Hungary accuses Ukraine of persecuting Hungarian minorities in parts of Ukraine. Zelensky said, the least we ask of Hungary is not to block Ukraine's invitation to NATO. That is, don't support, don't vote for us, but also don't block. So we'll wait to see whether that leads to some kind of rapprochement. We have seen the two countries in recent months trying to mend relations, so maybe that will move more towards the end of this year.
Well, thanks so much for that, Venetia. I'm getting a nostalgia trip having you back on with us. It's a pleasure. But now, as you'll know, all eyes are on Georgia this week following the contested elections, and we've been monitoring the situation there very closely. And for the latest on the situation, I'm pleased to welcome Marika now to the podcast, dialing in live from Tbilisi. Marika, in our last update on Georgia, we reported on the protests taking place and whether Georgians would continue to protest. What is happening at the moment there, and what is the mood in the capital? Welcome.
Hello, Francis. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. And Slava Ukraini, of course. Right now, I'm connecting from the opposition headquarters, basically. The pro-European opposition parties who passed the threshold. There are 4 main camps within the opposition. The 3 are essentially fully merged functionally right now. And the 4th one is also cooperating with us quite closely. We are together with the president, who is an immense asset for us, especially internationally, in an effort not to legitimize these elections for basically this Russian regime in Georgia, as well as domestically, because now everyone sees that it's beyond just party politics, and she has this authority of being a non-partisan institution, basically the only institution that represents the European will of Georgian people. So yes, we had this one big protest, which was, by the way, larger than expected. So we need to consider this local context right now, because I know that many people expected that once the fraud was out, so once the elections were fraudulent, everyone would simply be out in the streets and chaotically, I don't know, maybe storm the parliament or something. But Georgians have been through multiple waves of protests throughout these last years, even before it made international news. And we know that sometimes we can be emotional protesters, but we need a plan. And now was the first major time when people took it somewhat cool-headed, which is an asset, I would say. And we began planning on possible scenarios. And the opposition has several key points right now, in coordination with the president too, of course. It is not to legitimize the parliament for this Russian government, which means we will not be taking our mandates and they will be alone in their parliament. Second is providing evidence to our Western partners, evidence of fraud, for them to not legitimize these elections. And this process has been going quite good, I would suppose, because up till now, the Georgian government received congratulations only from Russians, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Hungary, Azerbaijan, and so no democratic state congratulated them. Everyone underlines the importance of irregularities, violations, and the importance of inquiry. And the US State Department even said that they don't even think that it should be Georgian officials who investigate these elections. And they are thinking with European partners about optimal body who will investigate these elections. So we work on non-cooperation with the regime and international delegitimation. Our main demand is new elections conducted by International Election Administration, because our Georgian election administration is absolutely fully controlled by the regime, and the regime is on its own fully controlled by the Kremlin, and there's growing evidence to that, and just the overall political picture only points to that. Rallies will be a big part of our protest, of course. Without public participation in the streets, all other efforts will be to a large degree crippled. So we will be planning on rallies, but it needs a very careful planning, for it not to result in, frustration or some semi-successful outcomes, because we cannot afford semi-successful outcomes right now. So we have the next big rally on Monday evening, and this will also be where we reiterate our plan to the public, and we will request international inquiry to these elections, and we will also present to the public all key evidences and patterns of fraud.
Thank you. Well, it's really interesting hearing your perspective on this. I mean, I wonder if we could talk a little bit more broadly about the collective mentality shift that's happened this spring during the protests around what was called the Russian bill, of course, that we covered extensively at the time. How does that play in to what we're seeing now and the general sort of social, cultural aspects of the way in which many Georgians feel about their government and indeed their country at this delicate moment?
That's a really great question, Francis. Thank you very much. So it really feels like a nation-forging experience this last month and last weeks. We do not fully appreciate the process because we are very worried about the outcome. Of course, the outcome is never guaranteed, but for observers and for academics, it's a very interesting process. So evidence supported that stereotype that Georgians need a very centralized leadership to protest, and if they do not achieve their objectives in a couple of days, then they get tired, go home, and they cannot self-organize, and so on. These protests proved it totally wrong. We had protests without any visible leadership. It sustained itself for 7-8 weeks. It was, I would suppose, the biggest grassroots protest in Georgia, but also it penetrated every layer of society. Absolutely every layer, every age group, every social background, and so on. So we see the birth of a civic nation and real civic society. And in a way, I think that what happened, while it is extremely unfortunate, the elections were outright stolen and the president says that it was a Russian special operation, to some degree it is absolutely historically logical that such a regime as the Georgian Dream, a regime of thugs and criminals who are only interested in power and money, they would not just leave. And for people to actually decisively act, we had to get rid of illusions that it is possible to win against them with elections. Because in 2020, there were also allegations and some evidence of fraud, but there was no widespread sentiment that the elections are completely done in the country. And now, finally, there is this evidence and sentiment among the public. We, the opposition, were fully committed to the legal process, to the election process, and we convinced our people that we were winning. Because the specific schemes of fraud that they deployed, it was actually not very anticipated. Now we are getting some resentment from public that how we could sow anticipation of victory to them. So it is not like the opposition was a priori crying out that the election would be rigged. But now, in hindsight, that is what people see. And so this puts us to a new level of self-organization and public consolidation. And I very much hope that once it is done and once we win, this will mean that we are one of the most conscious and civically advanced nations in Europe.
Interesting, thank you. And just one final question from your perspective, if you could elaborate a little bit more on the precedent for other countries nearby Georgia within the territory that Russia sees as formerly its own. These foreign agent laws are being prepared elsewhere too. What would your message be to listeners in those countries?
Yes, definitely. It's a regional phenomenon. And I suppose that Georgia is now the decisive factor and somewhat a testing ground because the stakes in Georgia are very high. So these laws have been adopted either in Central Asia, who are unfortunately too far away from a democratic world, or in EU enlargement area and EU proper. For example, something similar is in Hungary, and Slovakia is also preparing something similar, albeit a somewhat less grave version. So the area that is the enlargement area, where democratization and freedom and Europeanization is possible, but also we are not necessarily somewhat protected by the European Union Court. This is the area where civic resistance actually does matter a lot. And with civic resistance in Georgia, unprecedented one, and Western support, because it's the first time that, for example, the United States has sanctioned Georgian officials. If Georgians do not win now, all autocrats and wannabe autocrats in EU enlargement area mostly, but also maybe elsewhere, maybe even in EU, they will be emboldened to pursue this law and other illiberal, undemocratic laws. So this is why it is very important that Georgians have to be supported fully in this fight. And what Westerners should do is first and foremost, not provide any legitimacy for the government. Do not shake hands with them. This regime, they are not yet fully consolidated within themselves. It is not a Lukashenko regime in the sense that all pillars of enablers are fully loyal to the regime. It is possible to put pressure on their pillars by lack of legitimacy, because what they always benefited from was ambiguity, and lack of legitimacy will provide clarity, what is needed for whoever can defect will defect, because the benefits will be taken away and they will be facing real consequences of confrontation with the West, also on their social status, their benefits, their families, and so on. And sanctions, travel bans are very important also on family members, and clarity is just the most important thing in this situation, because the Georgian dream wins with ambiguity, because they're ruling and now illegitimately over a population that is consistently 85% pro-EU. So Georgians should be supported, and the people in especially EU enlargement area, they should always be very alerted in their own societies. They should never assume, as unfortunately many Georgians did, that just because we are progressing and our population is very pro-Western, that we are somehow immune from being taken back to the Russian orbit. Because unfortunately, some of Georgians, many Georgians, and even some of the political class had this illusion of safety and security that it was impossible to autocratize Georgia and put Georgia back on Russian orbit. So I would simply tell everyone in those societies and beyond that please support Georgia and also stay alerted, because even small steps towards autocracy can snowball before you even notice it. And impossible things, unfortunately, have proven possible in Georgia, for example. And I would suppose, like Ronald Reagan said, we didn't pass freedom to our children down the blood. So it needs to be monitored every day and fought for. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Marika, and you're very welcome to stay on, if you can, for final thoughts. Now, moving on, earlier this week, I cited a report by Jack Watling of the Royal United Services Institute that cited the dangers of Ukraine and, by extension, the West, agreeing to a Brest-Litovsk-style negotiations. Now, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is one of the most important treaties in history, with huge ramifications for Germany, Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and Russia. But it also offers lessons in the risks of entering negotiations when the momentum is firmly with one power over another. So I know Brest-Litovsk won't mean much to everybody. So to do a deeper dive into this subject, I'm thrilled to be welcoming back to the podcast historian Dr. Thomas Clausen, dialing in from Deutschland. Thomas, mein Freund, let's return to the lecture hall. It's October 1917. The Bolsheviks have seized power from the provisional government which overthrew the Russian Tsar. The First World War rages, with the Germans and Central Powers advancing deeper into the Russian Empire. What happens next, and why is what happens next so important?
Thank you very much for having me again. And I should maybe start by explaining why going back to the lecture hall is a good idea, because it might seem a bit odd in our times to be talking about the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk of 1918. But we're not just living in historical times, but in times shaped by competing visions of history. And of course, one of the main visions is Putin's imperial understanding of history, where the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk holds quite a prominent place. So some of the listeners might recall that he even quoted the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in his speech on the 21st of February, so right on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine. And I think if we dive down deeper a bit, we will see why it's important to get the history right, because it's not just about understanding the treaty, but it's also about understanding that we have a sort of competing visions of history, where you have an understanding of sovereignty that flows directly from brute force and the ability to overpower others, and the other vision, the more Western and democratic vision, where sovereignty rests with the people. And all in all, we can say that we are still living in the aftermath of the First World War in that sense, when those competing visions were first lying on the table. But to go back to the question, so what is happening in October 1917, which is clearly one of the crucial moments in the history of the 20th century? By the time, the war is going very badly for the Russians, Imperial Russia, of course, and that's one of the main reasons why the Bolsheviks came to power in the first place. So the provisional government of Kerensky was not able to conclude the war, rather the opposite. They start an offensive. That's a huge failure. In July 1917, there are severe shortages of food. And on the 25th of July 1917, German troops capture Ternopil in western Ukraine. And in September 1917, they take Riga. But the key development is less on the military front, but on the Russian home front. And to begin with, and that's, I think, an aspect that often does not quite get the attention that it deserves, the Bolshevik coup is, to a substantial degree, the result of a German intelligence operation. Lenin is famously brought to Petrograd in April 1917, and the Germans hope that the Bolshevik demands for bread and peace will ultimately take Russia out of the war. And by the winter of 1917, when the rations given to the soldiers were extremely limited, this promise looked attractive. And that's the moment when the negotiations between the Central Powers and the Bolsheviks begin. They will last for roughly 4 months, and then the treaty is signed. And the negotiations are extremely strange. And that's one of the reasons why I think the comparison now between a potential negotiation between Ukraine and Russia is probably going to look very, very different, because during those winter months of 1917-18, the German delegation, the delegation of the Central Powers, also Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, that's the usual team of diplomats, politicians, military leaders, and of course, most of them aristocrats. But the Russian delegation is a very odd combination, including a random peasant who was picked up when Lenin and Trotsky were on the way to the train station in Petrograd, but also a female terrorist. And importantly, that's also not the only negotiation that's happening, because the Central Powers also separately conclude a peace treaty with the People's Republic of Ukraine, which was signed on the 9th of February 1918. In those negotiations, the Ukrainians promised huge deliveries of grain to the Central Powers. The Bolsheviks don't like this, and they also don't want Ukrainian independence. And on the same day, they seized Kyiv from the Centralnaya Rada, which had proclaimed Ukrainian independence on the 22nd of January. And unsurprisingly, then the Ukrainians turn to the Germans. They start the 11 Days War, the last major operation of the First World War on the Eastern Front. On the 18th of February, they expel the Russians from Ukraine, and they force them to conclude the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on the 3rd of March. So that's basically the prehistory of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk.
Thank you. It's a very complicated story, but an important one. As you say, the momentum was very much with the Germans and the Central Powers when the negotiations began. And whilst Trotsky and the Bolsheviks stall for time, ultimately the Germans do relaunch their offensive because they're unsatisfied with the direction of travel at the discussions. Are there other examples of that in history which feels very relevant to what could be conceivable in the current discussions around negotiations on Ukraine?
I think in some sense, it's not just a unique occurrence, but I think the standard occurrence, because the basic insight is that peace negotiations depend on both parties believing that they have nothing to gain by military force. And it's clear that Germany in the spring of 1918, that's also when the final big offensive in the West happens, they thought that they had quite to gain something by military force. And the Bolsheviks had no chance of beating the Kaiser, especially after the Tsar and Kerensky had already failed. So in that sense, the main story is that if there's one party that has a military advantage and they can use this military advantage to press for further changes on the battleground, then it's very likely that they will do it and they won't come to the negotiation table before then.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Now, since we're on the subject of the First World War, looking at this further from the perspective of the Ukrainians, what happened in the First World War on its territory? What did Ukrainians experience? And you've already alluded to this, but what were the ramifications for Ukrainian statehood as a whole? It's a bit of a forgotten war. We focus so much on the Second World War and the experience of Ukraine, but we forget about the first. Really interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, so the first time I thought about this was, I think, at some point in the autumn of 2013, when Professor Shai Leven at Trinity gave a lecture on this topic. And 1 year later, in 2014, he published a very interesting book on the Russian role in the First World War called Towards the Flame. And the first line of that book says, as much as anything, the First World War was turned on the fate of Ukraine. And I think that's very true. It is above all an Eastern European conflict, even though especially in Britain, there's, of course, a huge focus on the Western Front, Verdun, Passchendaele, the Somme, Flanders, etc. But it's above all a conflict that starts in Central Europe with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and the region in the 20th century is basically shaped by the outcome of the war. And ironically, all four major powers who are fighting this war in the East, so the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, the German Kaiserreich, and Tsarist Russia, they all lose. And that's, of course, I think the key starting point for a lot of developments that we are still processing today. And it's not only the war in Ukraine at the moment, but also, for example, the Israel-Palestine conflict that can be seen as a result of that particular war. But coming back to the role of Ukraine in the First World War, so at the outbreak of the First World War, of course, Ukraine was not an independent state. It was divided between the majority of Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, and the Western regions, in particular Galicia, was a part of Austria-Hungary. And Ukrainians also fought on both sides of the conflict. So the majority, around 3.5 million Ukrainians, fought for the Imperial Russian Army. Around 300,000 fought for Austria-Hungary. And that's very characteristic of the war in itself. So it's also true for the Poles, who are fighting for the Germans, the Austrian Hungarians, and of course also for the Tsarist Empire. And this is also one of the reasons, I think, why the war isn't really remembered as a war in Eastern Europe, because there's basically no nation to remember it, or all the states who fought this war have ceased to exist. And after all, memory is still very much shaped by sort of a state to put up the memorials. And there was no one left in 1918 to put up war memorials for this part of the conflict. Now, Ukraine in those years, the war basically rages on for several years. It's a war of movement for a long time. Then there are some trenches. Initially, the Imperial Russian Army even makes inroads into Germany. So the First World War is a war which also takes place on German soil, which I think is very important to consider, especially in later years, when especially the myth of pushing the Russians out in 1914 becomes a huge boost to Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who are the generals responsible for that defense. But in Ukraine, especially in Galicia, the fate of the war changes back and forth. But in the course of 1917, as I talked about earlier, the Russian army basically loses. We talked about what happened in Ukraine between the October Revolution and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And that is the moment when the situation is becoming increasingly confusing. Ukraine will have 4 different governments in 1918 alone. And turned out that the Central Powers were not happy with the Centralnaya Rada. And very soon they replaced it after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the hetmanate of Pavlo Skoropadsky. This is basically a German vassal state. It lasts until November 1918, when it's replaced with the so-called Directorate of Ukraine, and subsequently the Western Ukrainian People's Republic. And now it becomes really quite painful for Ukraine, because Ukraine finds itself in the middle of the so-called death triangle. It's surrounded by Bolsheviks, by white Russian troops, and also by Polish troops, all with different interests. So The First World War immediately flows into the Russian Civil War and the Polish-Soviet War. And at the end of it, by 1922, the Soviet Union is established. But of course, the independent Ukrainian state that was formed briefly in those years is crushed.
Thank you. And it's just a tapestry of bloodshed, that period. You mentioned there the creation of the Soviet Union, which comes shortly afterwards. I just want to return to what you said at the start. You mentioned the role of the First World War in Putin's worldview. And why do you think we should think about the First World War when it comes to understanding this current conflict, beyond the similarities of certain battlefield conditions on the front lines? How pivotal is this?
So if we look at Putin's own words, I would say that he thinks that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the humiliation that was placed by the Germans on the Russian Empire is similar to the breakdown of the Soviet Union. And in both cases, he seems to think that Russia has been stabbed in the back. And in this notorious speech on 21st of February 2022 that I referenced earlier, he said, and I wrote this down, after the revolution, the Bolsheviks' main goal was to stay in power at all costs. Absolutely at all costs. They did everything for this purpose, except the humiliating Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, although the military and economic situation in Kaiser Germany and its allies was dramatic, and the outcome of the First World War was a foregone conclusion and satisfied any demands and wishes of nationalists within the country. Now, it seems like complete madness that all the suffering that Russia has been inflicting upon Ukraine since Putin's speech goes back to these arguments about history. But if one looks at Putin's utterances as a whole, it's pretty clear why the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is relevant. He uses it almost as a sort of lens through which he looks at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which he called famously the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Basically, he says in 1918, the Germans created Ukraine as a vassal state to achieve dominance over Russia. And now, after 1990, the collective West, and particularly the US, have done the same. And I think that's absolutely crazy in a way, but it shows that there's absolutely no room for an independent Ukraine with self-determination that is not just the province of Imperial Russia, and it's also far more than a sort of instrument of Imperial Germany in this last phase of the First World War. There's an important study by a German historian, Peter Borowski, from 1970 on German-Ukrainian policy in 1918, and it's very clear that Imperial Germany had a very instrumental approach to Ukraine, but that it's also very clear that Germans always struggled with the Ukrainians themselves, and that's why they replaced the Centralnaya Rada, because it's very clear that the Ukrainians did not want to be a sort of vassal state of Germany, and that they did already consider themselves to be an independent nation. And that's, I think, something that Putin doesn't get, and that's why we are seeing this horrible bloodshed now for over 10 years.
Well, to borrow David's phrase, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, Thomas, for that. But before we go, we regularly hear on this podcast from our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell. Always interesting to hear the perspective from Germany, of course, vital in this war and indeed in the longer term future of Europe's security. What's your perspective regarding Germany's support of Ukraine at the moment? I'm especially interested in the stance taken by the German opposition that James was talking about a few days ago, which seems increasingly hawkish. Where is public opinion in your view?
Well, I mean, James talked about Friedrich Merz, the leader of the Christian Democrats, and indeed he is a bit more hawkish. Last week, as was mentioned on this podcast, he said, hesitation is not interpreted as prudence, but as cowardice. A free society must not allow this. And if another US president is elected on November the 5th who declares NATO obsolete, we Europeans will be on our own. So this is definitely a stance that is very supportive of Ukraine. But by contrast, the Social Democrats now have a new general secretary, Matthias Miersch, who hails, like Schröder, from Lower Saxony. And last week in an interview with the Stern, he had the following to say. So he was asked whether there should be room for Gerhard Schröder in the German Social Democratic Party. And he replied, yes, because otherwise Schröder would have to be expelled from the party. And you can appreciate his life's work overall, especially as chairman of the Hanover district, even if I have a fundamentally different view on Putin and the attack on Ukraine. But here too, we must not think in black and white categories. And this all happens at a moment when both the Social Democrats and the CDU in East Germany are trying to form a coalition, or three coalitions with Sarah Wagenknecht's new party, who's, of course, towing the line of the Kremlin. And this is, I find, quite worrisome. If you look at the opinion polls, the number of people who say the West should increase the military support to Ukraine, this has dropped slightly by 3 percentage points. If you look at a recent opinion poll, to 38% compared to June, and only 31% say it should be decreased. It's a rather mixed bag, so all in all. But if yesterday we witnessed Schröder's appearance next to Viktor Orban at a talk hosted by Roger Köppel of the Weltwoche in Vienna, and that can be seen as a Russian propaganda offensive that takes place not only in Germany, but in all places in the West. And unfortunately, I think this propaganda campaign is not entirely unsuccessful, especially because of the lack of strategy, and not least the lack of a communication strategy in the West. And it opens up the space for this perverse narrative that the only stumbling block for peace in Ukraine is Ukrainian obstinacy, which is an absolute version. And that's one of the reasons why I looked in the history books for another social democrat who maybe has a bit of a different perspective. And I came across Karl Kautsky, who published a book in Vienna in 1921, so to round off the historical arch here. And he spoke about Georgia, which precisely in those days was overrun by the Bolsheviks. And he told his social democratic audience at that time, and I think it's still a quote that works today: "Whatever torments and tribulations the unfortunate population of Georgia may still suffer at the hands of Moscow's blood-soaked rulers, it will and must rise again like a phoenix from its ashes. Russia can only prosper if it's conquered by the spirit that animates Georgia. That will be the revenge of the Social Democratic Caucasus Republic." And that's the social democratic voices I think we should be hearing today.
Let's turn to our final thoughts now. Since we're talking about World War I, I've been meaning to read out a message from a listener for many months now. They wrote in to say as follows: "I currently work as a German-Ukrainian linguist assisting Ukrainian refugees in Germany, and I'd like to share a story from one of my clients. I met a woman who fled to Germany after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. She was visiting the health department to assess her health and work capability. She told me she had been seriously injured in an explosion, nearly losing her leg and her hearing. At first, her story seemed sadly familiar. Many people I meet in these settings have suffered injuries because of the war. But she explained that her injury happened while hiking in the Carpathians with friends in 2021, even before the invasion. She and her friends had camped, lit a fire, and then a blast erupted, tragically killing 2 of her friends and injuring her and others. As it turned out, they had unknowingly set their fire on an undetected World War I shell, which detonated. Hearing her describe this experience, the loss of friends and nearly a limb due to an event rooted in a century-old conflict, moved me deeply. It made me think about the enduring impacts of war. I realised I know very little about Ukraine's history in World War I. I know much more about World War II, since people like my grandparents have shared their stories. And of course, I know the recent events. But I wonder, how long will it take until it's safe to hike freely in Ukraine's forests? Perhaps it never will be, if even now people are dying from century-old shells. What is being done in Ukraine to clear these areas? Who maps and oversees this effort? Are there any international commitments about clearing war legacies like mines and unexploded ordnance? We hear a lot more about these weapons, important as they are right now, but what about their remnants? We ended up reflecting on the current war. She said she'd always dreamed of learning German and joked, dreams do come true, but at what cost? I replied that I'd always wanted to work with refugees, and now that dream too has come true. But at what cost? So thank you very much to that listener, and to the rest of our final thoughts now. Marika, would you like to go first? What would you like to leave our listeners with?
Oh, I guess I will continue from your very interesting thought now. And we know in Georgia that we will win and we will be free and democratic and European. But at what cost? Exactly. So I hope that the costs aren't that high, and for our costs to be minimal and the transition to be as smooth as possible, we need maximal support from our friends abroad. from providing clarity, not shaking hands with these autocrats, and sanctions and travel bans. And just in general, keep in mind that this Russian war against freedom in the world has lots of different theaters and aspects. Ukraine is defending us all through military means, and it seems like Georgia is now at the front line of civic freedoms and fighting for civic freedoms, and this forms one big picture. And also Moldova in just a couple of days, I think it's November the 3rd, when they have a runoff of presidential elections. And we should very much expect a lot of Russian rigging for Maia Sandu to be defeated and for Moldova to be essentially decoupled from European enlargement. So, well, overall, I'm an optimist. Let's stay positive, but put all our efforts into, as we are, I'm sure, let's just keep our spirits high and continue doing what we are doing. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Well, if idealism is the compass, then pragmatism is the map. Venetia, Rainey, where would you like to leave our listeners today?
I guess two things. I was really struck by something Marika said about how you can't take freedom for granted and how authoritarianism can creep up slowly and things that you didn't think were possible can quickly become possible. I think it's interesting in the context of the increasing cooperation between Russia and North Korea. We think things are very bad in Russia now, but they can get worse. We shouldn't be blithe about this increasing cooperation. It is really dangerous, and the growing tentacles of the war and what that means for Asia, I think that's worrying, and we shouldn't just write it off as a small development just because North Korea is sometimes almost joke-worthy in its sort of pariah-like status. And then the other thing I wanted to say quickly was that it's such a pleasure to be back on this podcast. It's really bringing back memories of sitting around a table at the back of the Telegraph with David right at the beginning of the war, and him saying, we're going to do this podcast every day, and me saying, that is absolutely mad. You don't know how long this war is going to go on for. But he did it. And as I got to know him, I understood his passion and his dedication and his determination. And I haven't been on the podcast for quite a few years, working on daily news. You get subsumed into all the other stories, and, Ukraine drops out the front pages of the papers, and the foreign desk's priorities were elsewhere. But David and you, Francis, and Dom and Roland and the rest of the team on Ukraine the Latest have kept doing the hard work of speaking about all of this. And I know David was a huge part of that, and it's been a real blow, more than a blow. Blow doesn't really describe it. It's been a real cut to the heart, David's loss on the audio desk, and I know that's been felt throughout the Ukraine the Latest community, but it's a pleasure to be back on here and to be contributing and to remember just how much work you put into this and how much value it is.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words, Venetia. Thomas, as our second guest, you have the final thoughts for today.
Thank you. Yes, I can follow right here with what Venetia said. It's also my first time on the podcast since David's death, and I have to say I'm still completely shocked and very, very saddened by these events. I did not know him before March 22. And I've never met him in person, but I still remember sort of the sound of his voice in one of the first podcast episodes during those very dark days after Putin's full-scale invasion. And these were extremely difficult and glum days. I mean, it's still, we haven't seen the light yet, but in those days, it was not clear whether Ukraine would survive. Was maybe even the moment where Putin would try to reconquer all the territories of the former Warsaw Pact, maybe including Berlin and Dresden. I mean, these were sort of the thoughts running through my head in those days. And who knows what would have happened if Putin had succeeded in those weeks. And these were days that were very disorientating. And then listening to David really did make a huge difference, because you could immediately see, or rather hear, that he was not only a fantastic journalist, but also a courageous citizen who displayed a great sense of moral clarity and purpose in those very, very difficult historical situation. And that made a difference for me, and I think also for hundreds of thousands of other people and listeners in Britain and in Germany and in Ukraine and everywhere. And I think what he would go on to achieve in these following years with the podcast, with keeping on the topic, which is, I think, still the most important topic of our time. And that was absolutely breathtaking. And of course, I'm still devastated by this loss. And when you channeled his quote at the beginning of the podcast, I had to sort of, it's tough, but it's also a testament to his work that the podcast still goes on. And I think it makes a huge difference.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We're also giving university students globally unlimited access to The Telegraph, completely free of charge. Just visit www.telegraph.co.uk/student-sub. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.